The day my father died, my uncle Walt sent flowers to the funeral home before he called me. That should have told me everything, but grief makes you slow to see what's standing right in front of you. My name is Callie Reyes. My father, Marcus Reyes, built Reyes Structural Group from nothing, a two-man welding shop in Tulsa that grew over 30 years, into a company that built bridges across 4 states. Walt, his younger brother, had been there from the start, listed as co-founder on paper mostly because my father was too generous to leave him off it. Everyone in the family knew who had actually built the company. Everyone except, apparently, a Delaware court 6 weeks after my father's funeral, when Walt produced an operating agreement I'd never seen, one that named him majority owner in the event of my father's death, signed and notarized 4 years earlier. My father had never mentioned it. Not once, not to me, not to my mother before she passed, not to anyone. I contested it. I lost. The signature matched, the notary was real, the timeline was airtight. Within 3 months, I'd gone from heir apparent to a woman locked out of her own father's building, watching my uncle's name get etched onto a lobby wall that used to say Reyes. I would have accepted it. Grief does strange things to your fight. If not for my grandmother, Dolores Reyes, who was 89 and dying slowly of the same thing that would eventually take my father, and who called me into her room at the care facility 8 months later and told me, in the flattest voice I'd ever heard from her, "Your uncle is a liar and I have proof and I've been waiting to see if you had the spine to ask me for it." I hadn't asked her for anything. She'd simply been waiting to see if I'd come back at all after losing everything, or if I'd disappear the way so many broken people do. Grandma Dolores had outlived 2 husbands and buried 1 son. She'd also, unbeknownst to anyone in the family, kept a private safe deposit box at a bank in Bartlesville for 11 years, one that neither my father nor Walt knew existed, because it held something she'd been protecting long before either of them needed protecting from each other. Inside was a single sealed envelope addressed, in her careful handwriting, to whichever of you finds this first and deserves it. I opened it in the parking lot, hands shaking, half convinced it would be nothing. An old photograph, a recipe, the kind of sentimental nothing dying grandmothers sometimes leave behind to soften the blow of losing them. Instead it was 3 pages, dense with her handwriting, dated the same year Walt claimed the operating agreement had been signed. She'd written it after overhearing a phone call. Walt, drunk on his own back porch talking to a man Dolores didn't recognize, laughing about how easy it had been to get Marcus's assistant, a young notary named Priscilla Dunn, to backdate a document, how a struggling single mother with student loans could be persuaded to notarize almost anything for $8,000 in cash and a promise that nobody would ever check. Dolores hadn't confronted him. At 81, grieving her husband, watching her sons already drifting apart over old resentments about who Marcus favored and who felt overlooked, she'd made a choice that had eaten at her for 8 years. She wrote it all down, sealed it, and waited to see whether her family would tear itself apart on its own before she ever had to intervene. "I thought your father would catch it himself," she told me later, when I sat by her bed with the letter trembling in my hands. "He was smart. I thought he'd notice something was wrong long before it mattered. I never imagined he'd die before he got the chance." The letter named Priscilla Dunn. It named the man on the phone, a corporate lawyer named Ted Aldrich, Walt's old college roommate who I would later learn had drafted the fraudulent agreement in the first place, and who had gone on in the 8 years since to become general counsel for Reyes Structural Group itself, sitting 2 doors down from Walt's office, protecting the lie every single day. Here is where the story should have been simple. Fraud, forgery, a notary who could be found and pressured into confessing, a lawsuit refiled with real evidence this time. Justice restored, credits rolling. It wasn't simple because Priscilla Dunn had been dead for 3 years. An overdose, alone in an apartment in Sand Springs, 2 months after her own daughter was born. And when I finally tracked down her sister, hoping for some corroborating scrap of proof, what I found instead broke something open in me that had nothing to do with the company at all. Priscilla hadn't taken $8,000 because she was corrupt. She'd taken it because Walt, through Ted Aldrich, using the same casual cruelty they'd applied to my father's legacy, had threatened to report her for a minor notarial error on an unrelated document, one that would have cost her the license she needed to keep her job, at a time when she was pregnant, unmarried, and 1 missed paycheck from losing her apartment. They hadn't bribed a willing accomplice. They'd blackmailed a desperate young woman into complicity, then let her carry that weight alone until it killed her, while they built an empire on top of the silence they'd forced out of her. That was the twist that changed what kind of story I was living in. This wasn't just about a stolen company anymore. It was about a man who had made a habit for most of his adult life of finding people too vulnerable to fight back and using them as tools, then discarding them. My father's trust, Priscilla's desperation, and eventually I would learn his own son. Walt's boy, my cousin Danny, was 24 and had spent the last 2 years as VP of Operations, a title everyone assumed he'd earned. What I found, digging through the same financial records that had once been used to bury me, was that Danny had discovered the forged agreement himself 18 months earlier, and confronted his father about it. Walt hadn't denied it to his own son either. He'd simply told Danny that the company would be his one day regardless, that the how didn't matter, only the outcome. And then when Danny pushed back too hard, Walt had quietly begun grooming a replacement, cutting Danny out of major decisions, positioning to install Ted Aldrich's own son in the VP role within the year. Danny had been drowning in the same rot Walt had built the whole company on top of, and nobody, not me, not my father, not Grandma Dolores, had known he was already an ally. We built the case together, Danny and I, in secret over 4 months. Danny had access Walt had never thought to lock down. Internal emails, old accounting records, a paper trail of the consulting fees, paid to Ted Aldrich the same month the operating agreement was dated, disguised as unrelated legal work. Grandma Dolores's letter gave us the story. Danny's access gave us the proof. We didn't go to court first. Courts had already failed me once, slowly and expensively, in a system where a well-funded liar can outlast a grieving daughter. Instead, 3 weeks before the company's annual shareholder meeting, a room full of investors, board members, and local reporters who covered Reyes Structural Group's bridge projects as regional business news, Danny requested time on the agenda to present a compliance update. He stood in front of that room, 24 years old, and laid out the forged operating agreement, the blackmailed notary, the consulting fees that were really a payoff, and the 8 years of silence that had followed. He didn't do it for revenge on his own account. He did it, he told me afterward, because he'd finally understood that staying quiet to protect a family name only protects the people willing to abuse it. Walt didn't go to prison. The statute of limitations on the forgery itself had nearly run out, and proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal court would have taken years I wasn't willing to give him. But the board didn't need criminal proof. They needed a fraction of what Danny presented to vote him out within the hour, install an interim CO, and open the door for a civil suit that, 6 months later, restored majority ownership to my father's actual estate, meaning me, with damages that included the full value of what Walt had extracted in the 8 years he'd run the company on stolen ground. Ted Aldrich lost his license. Walt lost the company, the lobby wall, and the part one hadn't expected to feel any satisfaction over, but did, his son, who moved into the CO role himself 18 months later at my recommendation, because he'd earned it in a way his father never had. Grandma Dolores died 4 months after the shareholder meeting, peacefully in her sleep, having lived just long enough to see Reyes go back up on the lobby wall in the exact typeface my father had chosen 30 years earlier. I asked her once, near the end, why she'd waited 8 years to give me that letter instead of confronting Walt the moment she overheard him. Because truth that arrives too early gets buried by people with more power than you, she said. I needed you to be the one holding it when it finally mattered. Not me. You. She was right in the end about more than she probably meant to be. The company hadn't just been stolen by a lie. It had been protected for 8 years by every person too afraid or too powerless to speak. Priscilla, Danny, even Dolores herself for a while. What finally broke it open wasn't a court or a confession or even the letter itself. It was the moment enough of us stopped being afraid at the same time.